You, David Hoffman.
I think in the short term, the key to economic development is getting the stimulus package out of Washington more quickly. We appropriated $700 billion of our tax funds in February. And while we have the Republicans telling us that it hasn't worked, only 30% of it has come out of Washington. And both with regard to economic development more broadly and with the more immediate need for the creation of jobs. What we need to be doing is getting the rest of that $700 billion package out of Washington as soon as possible. There are other short-term things that we need to do for job creation, and the most important of those relates to getting banks to lend money to businesses, especially small businesses. The reason that small businesses in particular have been unable to do what they want to do, which is hire and expand, is because they cannot get credit. And the fact that the banks caused this collapse and then have not been helping society after we bailed them out with loans is wrong, and there are a variety of things the federal government needs to do to address that. What happened in the banking industry, the collapse that collapsed on all of us, was nothing more than a failure of accountability. I agree with the critique from the Financial Times that what's happening in Washington is simply not sufficient. We need a change that includes a much more robust Consumer Finance Protection Agency that the banking industry so far has been successful, including the community banking industry, in weakening and limiting their jurisdiction. I know as someone who's a former watchdog the importance of making sure that the powers of an oversight agency are strong. I was very disappointed that they defeated the so-called cram-down provision, which would protect consumers in bankruptcy and stop protecting banks. Mortgages are one of the only debts that people who are legitimately in bankruptcy aren't able to get protection from a judge from. The banks get protection when a consumer goes into bankruptcy, but consumers do not, with an inability to get their mortgage written down like all their other debts. And we do need to increase the capital requirements for the big banks and the community banks who have been irresponsible in terms of withdrawing too much money and putting their banks in harm's way. Well, while I'm a big supporter of health care and universal coverage, I feel compelled to respond to that attack. I'm thrilled that the former banker, state treasurer for the last 3 years, has brought up the issue of banks. I certainly don't think it's someone we need as a nominee in the general election. And he needs to get his facts straight. I, like many Americans, own stocks in a wide variety of companies. I do own stocks in 2 of the big banks. My holdings in those banks amount to less than 1/10 millionth of a percent of the ownership of those banks. And this person to my right, however, owns a much greater amount of a bank where not only was he has been and still is a large owner, but for 3 years helped run that bank, a bank that is now, and let's be clear, banking has nothing to do with my history, my work, anything like that. But the person to my right, it's a critical part of his experience. In fact, he's only held 2 jobs. And the job that just before this one was as the vice president and chief loan officer of a bank that is now one of the worst performing in the country. So I'm happy to continue this discussion at any time.
You know what? I'm going to ask everybody to hold on to their applause.
I agree that the public option is of critical importance. It's not clear that we're going to get this in the Senate bill, but moving to some system of universal coverage is of critical importance. And I also think of critical importance is focusing on the cost side. And one of the things that's notable about the likely Republican nominee, Mark Kirk, is that he voted against a plan that would have lowered prescription drug costs in the Medicare system for all the beneficiaries. And it was really a vote that protected the big pharmaceutical industry, an industry that has provided a huge amount of PAC money to Mark Kirk. And we need a nominee who is going to be strong in terms of being able to take on Mark Kirk and criticizing him for the votes like that one that protect industry and don't protect all of us. What is wrong? What is wrong with allowing the beneficiaries of Medicare to pull together and use our leverage to negotiate better prices against big drug companies? There's nothing wrong with it. It would lower prices, and it's an important part of this reform that we need in this bill.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Alexei. David on Thompson.
I agree with everyone else on this stage that it makes sense to have the plan to move the detainees to Thompson. Mr. Janulius continues to try to turn toward me and attack, and he wants to elevate the debate, yet he's continuing to do that. He talks about that it's not fair to talk about the bank because it's about his family. What the voters in this room and around the state deserve is a comparison between the candidates and the records. And when you're 33 years old and you've only held 2 jobs, and your first job was as the chief loan officer of your family's bank, it's worth looking at how your performance was. That performance and that bad performance is showing up in the bad performance of the bank now. It has nothing to do with his family. It's about his job performance when he was at the bank. And fundamentally, I don't know how he can ask us to trust him with the nation's business in Washington when he couldn't even protect the people's money in his job as treasurer with regard to the Bright Start program, a program that on his watch lost $85 million when the money was invested in risky mortgage-backed securities and junk bonds after families were told that their money was safe. Making sure that we have the right safety net for all our citizens through unemployment benefits, through extending COBRA, through extending food stamps is of critical importance. We have 2 members of our family who are suffering through unemployment, and I hear from them every day how difficult it is to find a job and how their unemployment benefits as well are close to running out. This is of critical importance. Those at the top end of society, those of the most powerful who caused this collapse, they need to pay things back. We need the banks to get lending again because they're the ones who caused this. And those who are on the lower end of the spectrum, they need our help. They need to make sure that we continue to pay for the safety net. And if Illinois needs help from the federal government to make that happen, then we need to make that a reality. I don't believe the window is closing, but I do believe it is a critical priority for the United States and the world to move and push for peace in the Middle East as quickly as possible. I agree with the premise of the question that we do need a 2-state solution in the Middle East. We do need to move to a world where we can see Palestinian statehood. And in order to do that, the United States needs to be a leader, as we have been, in pushing both sides to make concessions so that we move to a world of peace as quickly as possible. Fundamentally, this is not going to happen unless both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, want it as much as possible. This cannot be imposed from the outside. And while we need concessions from both sides, and that has to include most fundamentally the concerns about terrorism on the Palestinian side in Gaza. And there are concessions that need to be made on both sides, including on settlements by the Israelis. There is no more difficult issue that we face in the world than trying to achieve peace in the Middle East. But we need to continue our historical role as leaders from the United States of America to push for this. I think if we're honest with ourselves, it will be virtually impossible to convince fellow senators in Washington that the money is not going to be wasted here in Illinois unless we change the way we operate things in Illinois. Until we start electing officials who are A+ on ethics and integrity and who have no connection whatsoever to the problems of the past, it will be impossible to convince the people in Washington. We need to pass in Illinois the kind of reforms that we on the Illinois Reform Commission requested and recommended. Some of those reforms were passed with regard to the way the contracts are handed out and that do increase transparency. But fundamentally, we need to change what our officials do. When Mr. Giannoulias talks about not taking federal lobbyist money, what he leaves out is that he takes state lobbyist money. And one of the big problems is that federal money comes here and gets under the control of people like state lobbyists. That's one of the critical reasons why I have said that part of running a clean governmental and election campaign for the United States Senate includes taking no lobbyist money, including the kind of state lobbyists who would try to get their claws on federal funds that are brought back home.